All right, welcome everyone. It's the second day of our little seminar on moral psychology, religious group formation, and virtue, and various other things. I'm happy to welcome Michael Laakasuo, who is a social psychologist and a docent of cognitive science here, and he leads a research group whose name is already here, Moralities of Intelligent Machines, and presenting some results that they have recently had. So take it away, Michael.
Thank you. I guess I have about an hour, then we have about 10 to 15 minutes to talk about stuff. And I understood that you want a little bit of the perspective of in-group, out-group juxtaposition between different groups. So although my research isn't exactly that, there is an element of that. And in order for me to bring that out, I decided that I would rather go quickly through the themes that I have been studying, and then we can zoom into some of the results. So first I will show you shit tons of stuff which will make you anxious and you feel like you can't follow it. But the idea is that then once you know what's there, we can talk about what might be interesting to you guys specifically, because I'm not a theologian or a student of comparative religion. So I don't necessarily completely understand what would be interesting to you. So then we can focus after I go through it quite quickly. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Good, because if you want a more traditional way of me presenting it, then I will cut stuff out and I will focus on some key things. That's another alternative. So which one would you prefer? The first or the second?
The first.
First, okay, great. So, in 2015, Nature published this sort of a news feature or like a small analytical piece about medical ethics and problems of AI related to medical ethics, and they brought up the question that if you have an unreluctant patient who would need to take their medication but they refuse, and there is no human present but only an AI or a robot, how should the AI or robot behave? And I decided that when I saw this news piece that, okay, you're asking how they should do it, so I will run the study and I will get you the answer. So now it's 7 years later and I finally have some answers. We did 6 studies. I mentioned only 5 of them here, and I will only focus on the experimental studies here, where we gave a small story for our participants, which was a 2x2 experimental design. So it had either a human agent, a 35-year-old nurse called Lina, or Lina X, sophisticated nursing robot who works at the Central University Hospital, imaginary place that doesn't really exist. And then she has orders to follow or make sure that patients are well treated and they receive their treatment and so forth. And the orders come from a higher up senior physician. And one day Lina or Lina X has an unreluctant patient who doesn't want to take their medication, and then the story ends in one of 2 ways. Either she respects the patient's autonomy and disobeys the orders given to her and doesn't medicate the patient, or follows the orders of the senior physician, ignoring the patient's will, and forcefully medicates the patient. And what did we measure? We had a dependent variable that had it's not 16 items, it's 10 items, but it had 10 items similar to this that we averaged together, and it had good psychometric properties. So each participant read only one version of the story in a 2x2 setting. And in this first study, study 2 here, we find that if we have a robot, the dark bar, making the forced medication decision, they are significantly less appreciated, or the decision is significantly less appreciated than if you have any of the other combinations, either human or robot respecting the patient's will, or the human making the forced medication decision. But if a robot makes the same decision in that vignette where the differences are quite small between the conditions, you find this drop in approval of overriding the patient's will. So keep this pattern in mind, because you will see it throughout the rest of the studies. In the next study, we altered the story in a way that we described the robot or the human nurse identically. Either they are good at their job and they are reliable, the same exact description for the robot, or they are not good at their job and they're unreliable. But when we have this sort of high competence manipulation, as it's called, we find the same effect as we find in the baseline condition. But when we have this low competence manipulation, what we find is that we expect, in a way, the humans who have like low competence or not enough trust in their abilities, we expect them to behave in a way a bit more that overrides the patient's autonomy. Otherwise, these things level up, and there is this general drop in approval of the decision. However, as you can see, low competent humans that nonetheless do what they're told to do are less appreciated than high competent humans, but you don't really see this sort of equally dehumanizing drop in the way the robot is treated. Then we altered the vignette one more time, where we kept the original vignette from here and we removed the competence manipulation, and the last sentence was, we just added one sentence: the next day patient is feeling the same way they did the previous day, or the next day the patient is found dead. In the vignette, we didn't imply any causality between the decision and the outcome of the vignette. This is called the moral luck effect in the moral psychological literature. And what we find is that when the patient is found alive the next day, we basically replicate this basic finding. But again, if the patient is found dead, then we find this general drop in human decision approval that we don't find for the robot. And again, it doesn't matter whether the human follows the orders or respects the patient's will. The fact that they're just unlucky changes the way their decision is evaluated, but we don't really find the same for the robot. We find this tick-tick pattern, high-low for the robot in both situations, whether the patient is alive or not. So then we tried to understand where this might be stemming from. Is it the level of mechanization involved in the treatment decision? It wasn't that, but if we keep, again, the supervising physician as either human or as an AI, we find again basically the same pattern that we find here for the human doctor, because it is the exact replication in a way. But what we find is an interesting detail here, that when we put the supervising physician as like an AI, and when the robot objects to the supervising AI's orders or recommendations, they disobey, then what we find is that this is the most approved or the most highly appreciated decision among our participants. It's the highest bar amongst all, and if you compare this height to the average of these three bars, then there is a statistically significant difference between the bars. So it's not the fact that there is a machine involved or the level of mechanization is, when you manipulate it, when you increase the level of mechanization, it doesn't attenuate or diminish the findings of the previous results. It basically keeps them roughly the same with slight changes that I'm not sure how reliable they are. Would these findings, this robot disobedience effect, would it replicate? I don't know. We didn't do that. But here are all the studies together. So there is clearly something when humans make a decision versus when a robot makes a decision. There is something there which is not merely about the level of mechanization of the decision or the command chain, whether there's a human in the loop or not. So then, to move forward, we have also studied cognitive enhancement, which is an age-old dream of humanity from the oldest Yoga Sutras of Patanjali to relatively modern era Western esotericism, that there is something that you can do to make your cognitive and sometimes physical abilities more enhanced. And this Goetia, it's like a collection of demons that supposedly MacGregor Mathers saved from some British library in an old manuscript that he then restored, which is like instructions of how to summon demons, and when you summon specific demons with a specific formula, you get certain enhancements in your cognition. This guy, for instance, it would be nice to have this sort of enhancement. He teaches philosophy, both moral and natural, and the logic, art, and also the virtues of all herbs and plants. He heals all distempers in man and gives good familiars. Familiars, I guess, is an old word for house pets, so basically you get a nice cat. So, in any case, it would be nice if you could enhance yourself with spells or with herbs or whatever. But in any case, this is a perennial theme in human history, in magic, history of magic, this human enhancement. And Pew Research Center in 2016 made a large-scale survey where they discuss human enhancement. So it's an interesting survey, so if you're interested in that, please take a look. And it says also here that human enhancement is at least as old as human civilization. People have been trying to enhance their physical and mental capabilities for thousands of years, sometimes successful and sometimes with inconclusive, comic, or even tragic results. I guess one of the most famous example of the tragic result is the example of Harlow's Dr. Faust or Faustus, I don't remember which one it was, who ends up being dragged to hell by the devil after he tried to enhance his cognition. A similar theme you can also see in Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash and Mona Lisa Overdrive by William Gibson. Like this idea that if you try to enhance yourself, you're committing some sort of sin and you will end up punished. If you try to become more than human, there's something evil about that. So, okay, this was the theme that we wanted to study. This is a paper that just came out 2-3 days ago in Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. There are 7 studies there where we studied how people feel about microchips inserted to the brain that is trying to make them into superhumans. And we started with this sort of vignette where we have 2050 and there are 3 endings to the story. And there is Alex, who is an office worker. He goes to health services and he has a chance to have an operation where a microchip would be implanted in his brain to improve his memory functions. And we have one of 3 endings. The operation would give him the ability to perfectly remember everything. The operation would restore his memory capacity to the level of his youth, or would repair impairments which are related to an early stage dementia. After discussing the potential risks with his physician, Alex signs up for the operation and enters the wait list. And we measured 3 different things from our participants. The participants read one of these 3 stories, and depending a little bit on the study, there were sometimes 6 stories, but that's a side issue. We measured moral approval. Example items are there. We averaged them together, good psychometric properties. We measured perceived unfairness or perceived fairness. We present the results as unfairness, perceived unfairness, so higher the bars, the more unfairness. And then we measured dehumanization, how much you consider Alex to be human after the operation. In the final version of the dehumanization scale, we had 10 items that had been averaged together. To make an extremely long story short, that took 7 years, 6 years, somewhere thereabouts, what we find for the moral approval is that when you have the situation where you have either the alleviation or the optimization condition, so optimization is the youth level, alleviation is the level of like healing a little bit of the brain so that the initial stages of dementia are stopped, and superhuman is superhuman. And when you have this comparison throughout all the studies that we run, you find that there is a little bit of less moral approval moral approval for alleviation, but there is a lot of disapproval for superhuman abilities. So this is a meta-analytic effect that we have throughout all the studies. The same thing for perceived unfairness. People don't really consider it unfair if you have level of youth level or healing a disease, but they do perceive it as having an unfair advantage if you have superhuman memory abilities. And for dehumanization, we clearly see that if you have superhuman abilities, you are more dehumanized than if you don't have those. So when you have something which is maybe a core attribute of you being human, you are perceived then to be less human. And this is usually the beginning point or justification for discrimination or creating in-group, out-group boundaries. Here is another way of looking at the results. Each level, or each level of the manipulation on each study. Study 1 was the basic thing. Study 2 was familiar, unfamiliar manipulation. Study 3 was whether surgery matters. So if you eat a pill that has nanomachines and they build the chip in your head, does it matter? It really didn't. And study 4 was comparing between traditional drugs and microchips. Again, no difference. Then in study 5A, we had IQ, mood. And in study 6, we controlled out an aspect of the vignette so that we can show that it's not just about reading the story that gives you the answers. So if the character in the story accepts the treatment, then we find the same effect as previously. But if the character in the story refuses, then all the differences for practical purposes either reverse or become irrelevant. For unfairness, it didn't really matter because the questions were formed in such a way that we didn't even expect there to be a change. So then we also measured different sorts of value clusters, and this is probably something you want to return to. I will just go over it quickly. Binding is Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theories. 3, the conservative factors, loyalty, authority, and sanctity, averaged together. Individualizing is harm and fairness, averaged together. Scientific hobbyism is clear, and sexual disgust is an evolutionary psychological measure. But what you can see is that when binding foundations go up, moral approval drops. It doesn't matter whether it's human level or superhuman level. And you can clearly see that when binding goes up, dehumanization goes up, and the same thing for sexual disgust. It's a long story what that is and what that measures. We can return to that. And individualizing more or less the liberal value cluster, we find this opposite trend. And scientific hobbyism, meaning the more you read scientific science fiction books, so forth and so on, your approval of these technologies goes up. Okay, so everybody knows the trolley dilemma. Hand up if you don't, put your hand up if you don't know the trolley dilemma. And you know the difference between the bridge version and the trolley version, like the switch version, right? Yeah. So here, if you pull the switch, then people approve roughly more generally of this decision. So here, the utilitarian option of saving 5 is preferred. And here, if you push the person down, people don't approve of that decision. So the so-called deontological decision is preferred more, although people argue that they are identical. But again, then if you bring in robots into this equation, does it function the same way? We already know about the moral machine experiment that was published in Nature with millions of participants throughout the world, where you find that geographically there are 3 different major regions in the world with different sorts of preferences for how the self-driving car should act. However, this was not what I was interested in. I was just interested in the fact that people do somehow feel differently about AIs making utilitarian decisions than humans. But given that there is this effect known as the Uncanny Valley, hand up if you don't know what Uncanny Valley is. Good. So, Uncanny Valley is a continuum that at one end you have non-human likeness, let's say industrial robot. On the other side, you have complete human likeness. And then you have likability or familiarity or whatever you want here on the y-axis. So people like different sorts of robots. More they resemble humans, or they like stuffed animals, the more they resemble humans. But once you get close to 90%, 95% human likeness, then something odd happens. You get this feeling of creepiness. When something is almost like human but not quite, you measure that likability or the familiarity, niceness of the target object. There's something off there and you don't appreciate that anymore. So then I wanted to know that if you have an uncanny robot and a non-uncanny robot, making either a utilitarian decision or a deontological decision in a trolley-type dilemma, will the appearance of the robot contaminate the approval of the moral decision? So, indeed, we had 4 different agents, one of them human, 2 sort of creepy-looking robots, and then 1 non-creepy robot. We had 4 trolley-type dilemmas that we averaged together, and our dependent variable was how acceptable do you find this decision, or in our case it was, I think, how moral. And then we had some other variables that I'm not going to talk about. We ran this study in Finland with a small sample and with a slightly larger sample online through mTurk. And this is basically how without this technical information, this is roughly how the experiment looked like. They read a story, and then on the next page it says, the agent made this decision in the story, and how moral do you think the decision was? That was the variable we analyzed. And indeed, what you will find then is that there will be this valley-shaped shift in how the moral approval is rated. There was no difference between deontological and a utilitarian decision. We tried to find that actually in 5 experiments, but here we only showed results of 2. So that didn't pop up reliably. There was a general disapproval of any decision made by a creepy-looking robot, and that creepy-looking robot is actually, if it looks familiar to you, that is George Clooney's face morphed with iRobot movie's Sonny. And if you're interested in this paper and the theoretical reasoning behind it, you will find, indeed, actually here we have in the introduction section, we have some stuff about in-group, out-group perceptions of humans versus robots and different human groups and dehumanization, and that part potentially influencing the stuff. So if that sort of literature review might be interesting to you, you will find it here. And then we've studied rescue robotics, where we have juxtaposed utilitarianism and culpability in a dilemma. Just to show you that this is not science fiction, this has already happened in real life. But the standard trolley dilemma, it has a problem. Always inaction is confounded, mixed, or associated with inaction. Inaction and deontology are the same decision. If you don't do anything, then you are being supposedly deontological. And if you act, then you are being utilitarian. So this has plagued the field of moral psychology for, I don't know, 15 years by now. And there are different methods of trying to unentangle these two, but the results thus far are difficult to interpret in a simple way. Let me put it that way. So what we wanted to do in our rescue dilemmas, we wanted to have 2 active decisions. So both decisions are commissions and there is no omission. So we made a vignette where two people on a motorboat are driving drunk and crash into another boat with a single person who's a fisherman, and who should the lifeguard rescue. That's the basic idea of our vignette. And the main point of interest in the following 7 studies that I'm only going to show 2 or 3, the main point of interest was to see how robots are judged differently from humans in utilitarian dilemmas when there is no omission, meaning that there is no inaction possibility. The vignette was quite long. It's a cold day, there's either a lifeguard robot or a human lifeguard, and they're both experienced or have a large database, and there seem to be 2 people who seem to be drunk boating, and the boats collide and they drift apart, and the fisherman drops to the sea, which is very cold, and the drunk drivers fall to the sea, and it's very cold, and the lifeguard or lifeguard robot can only save either the 2 guilty individuals or the fisherman who's innocent. And then we ask people these 5 questions, we average them together, we reverse code some of the items so that we get this index of moral approval that again has good psychometric properties. And in the first study we find this result, which might look a little bit similar. If a human saves either the fishermen or the motorboaters, there's no difference between the bars, but if the robot makes the utilitarian decision and saves the guilty party, there is this distinct drop in how the decision is evaluated. So then, 3-4 studies later, we make some alterations to the vignette in a way that either the fisherman is guilty or the motorboaters are guilty. And what is it that we find? You can ignore this stuff. So if the fisherman is guilty and there's only one of them, and an android-shaped robot decides to save the single guilty party, this is perceived the worst option of all. So when a human saves the guilty individual fisherman, there is a statistically significantly higher acceptance of that decision. And it doesn't matter whether you ask acceptance, wrongness, blame, whatever. We had 7 different individual items. The results are roughly the same every time. So this is the bar of interest. This is the statistically significantly different from all the others. And then, if it happens to be that both are guilty or neither is guilty, what do we find? So then what we find is that when nobody is guilty and the android does the saving of a single individual, that is the least preferred decision. If a human being saves the individual fisherman when neither is guilty, it's statistically significantly higher, or if both are guilty, clear difference. And even like it's lower than here as well, if both are guilty. So the general idea, however, is that when the android makes, in a sense, the most wrong decision, here you don't have guilt and utilitarianism, or culpability and utilitarianism juxtaposed together, but what you find is that then the worst decision is the non-utilitarian decision, and the guilt aspect, it still matters a little bit, but the main idea is that when the robot makes the non-utilitarian decision, we don't approve of that, but when human being makes the non-utilitarian decision, we approve of it more, and of course we would prefer in a situation like this that it is the utilitarian decision when the culpability has been removed from the story. And in general, if we do a meta-analysis of all our studies that we had, we find that whatever the decision of the robot, it's always judged more negatively than human decision. And here we've analyzed different combinations of things, but what you find is, this is the most crucial part. So when human versus robot saves the guilty, this is the biggest meta-analytic difference here that matters. But when both save the innocent, there's not really a difference between them. So why is it then that the robot is not allowed to save the guilty no matter what the number of the guilty party is? Then the final package of stuff. The nursing robot stuff will most likely be, if I'm lucky, accepted today. It seems like it. And the rescue robots hopefully will be coming out of the press, let's hope, before September. So it's also going through the process. So we know that the studies are appreciated by the community. But the next stuff I'm presenting is stuff that I'm currently working on. This is not coming out anytime soon. This is preliminary stuff, but it was inspired by this doom metal song by October Tide from Sweden. The song is called Deplorable Request. And the very first words of the song are shut it all down, as if like life is something that can be shut off, like a mechanical perspective on human life. So shut it all down, the facts and the memories, like very cognitive scientific beginning for a doom metal song. And then it goes on to describe the horrors of being left in some coma-like state, and the narrator is begging that he will be allowed to meet the benefactor forbidden to all humanity, meaning death. And then the final paragraph of the song is like, it's the request to a social community. Turn to the next page. It's talking to outside of himself or herself. Turn to the next page. Ease your depression. You will find it better when I'm gone. This will lead you insane. So the last paragraph is appeal to the community. Please let me go. I know this is paradoxical, and when you make the right decision, you will still feel bad about it. So it's like a very emotional twist at the end. But this song is one of the inspirations for these studies, along with, of course, what's happening in our society. So this is apparently a real thing, a suicide machine that's at display, or was at display at Sarko in Venice Design Museum. And then in Japan Times some time ago, there was this news piece related to COVID in 2020, that should algorithms be allowed to decide on human life? And then I was inspired to see that, okay, if this sort of stuff is going on, and indeed, people are actively developing so-called mortality prediction engines or mortality prediction machines. And the aim of these is to help doctors to make critical decisions. Mortality prediction can be very helpful for taking critical decisions, which can help in optimizing the resources available in the hospital, and also an extra opinion for doctors and family members in cases of euthanasia, ending life of patient to relieve pain and suffering. But again, it's like a mechanistic way of approaching human life, and the decision should be made from a resource preservation perspective. I don't condemn this perspective, I don't agree with it, I don't disagree with it, this is what's there in the abstracts of scientific papers. Machine learning techniques for mortality prediction in critical traumatic patients. The same stuff. So okay, our society is heading this way. Is somebody doing moral psychology of this? No, so I will do it. I will skip over the theoretical motivations. We can talk about those later, but you probably can deduce them yourself. So first, two different samples. Another one from online world, prolific academic data collection services, and a Finnish sample of internet users generally. Again, the same story. They read a story that takes place in 2050. The reason why 2050, because it's not too far away in the future, but it is close enough. so that people think they can still imagine it within their own life cycle. So machine learning has developed a lot. Mortality prediction engines have been developed. Alex is a victim of a traffic accident, has been in coma for 5 years. He's again treated in technologically advanced central hospital. Vital functions are collapsing. He's kept alive by artificial life support. Then there is either a coma check engine or a senior consulting physician that then advises robot or a junior physician to either end the life or let the life continue. And then we ask participants how much they approve of this decision, the same sort of DBs as you saw previously, the junior physician / robot physician who that carried out the decision, did what was right. And the first studies were 1 by 3, so we didn't have the full 2 by 2, the 4 conditions, but this is what you see. When you have human-human condition making the decision about ending the life, that decision is the most appreciated. When it's an AI combination, it's not considered good. So here we find the mechanization effect that we were trying to observe in the nursing robots, but we didn't, but here we find it. And this was the English-speaking sample, and in Finnish-speaking sample we find the same thing. The English-speaking data was of slightly higher quality, so that's why the effects are more pronounced, but clearly they trend in the same way. In second study, we had a full 2 by 2, so we had both the accept and reject, and we had AI, human, AI, human. And what we find is when it's about the approval of the decision, when a decision is to accept, we find this drop. So when you have 2 people, again it's highest. When you have a human making the final decision, getting instructions from an advanced AI, second highest. When you have senior physician giving instructions to a robot physician, second lowest, and the lowest is the AI condition. And what we find is that in general, the accept decision for euthanasia is higher than the reject decision. And here, when the decision is to reject the euthanasia, keep the patient alive, most of this stuff level out, but still the highest bar is when you have 2 people making the decision. But this was a decision, approval of the decision, and here, if we ask people to evaluate the processes of the hospital, then the hospital processes are most appreciated when you have, so this is disapproval of hospital processes, so the most approval is again human. This is indeed preliminary stuff, preliminary graph, so the axes switch around a bit. But yeah, those are the quick rundown of several different research streams where you do find the juxtaposition between human and machine, and humans aspiring to become machine-like. And we still have indeed plenty of time to discuss and zoom into some of the stuff that you might be interested in. So, any questions? And if there are no questions, I'm also happy with that, so no pressure about asking questions. Yes, Aku.
So could you say a little bit more about the sexual disgust thing? Because we've talked about this and it seems to correlate with some of the stuff that we also find quite interesting. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. So in evolutionary psychology, there are at least 2 different kinds of disgust processes. There are pathogen disgust processes and sexual disgust processes. Pathogen disgust is an emotion that helps humans to avoid becoming sick. It sometimes misfires, and then there is the avoidance behavior of people who are asymmetrical, for instance, due to an accident or whatever, and then avoidance behavior is triggered. So it's not perfect, like no evolutionary mechanism ever is, but it's an avoidance emotion that is triggered by phlegmatic substances like snot and spit and sometimes blood and other things. People avoid those things, noxious smells and so forth. And then sexual disgust is an interesting add-on or further evolutionary branching of pathogen disgust. It is a mate selection mechanism that allows people to evaluate whether another human being is potentially a good partner for them specifically. So it's experiencer and target specific emotion. However, it's also highly correlated with things that we might call conservative attitudes, like for instance disapproval of drug use, disapproval of memberships in certain clubs, and many other things. It's also usually correlated but not reducible to the binding foundations. It is clearly separate statistically based on a couple of recent analyses. And it is more sensitive in women. And in women it's more closely associated with also pathogen disgust experiences because for the simple reason that women pay a higher price for mating and the risks of mating, and in the case of pregnancy the women protect the embryo or the fetus from outside toxins and all sorts of disease vectors more carefully due to the nausea associated with pregnancy. So it's a complex device for survival and procreation. And there's a lot of research coming out of sexual disgust. There is in evolutionary psychology potentially a third disgust dimension, which is moral disgust, but personally I've tried to study it close to 10 different times. I never find evidence for it, and there are some review articles which suggest that it might not even exist. So, but the debate is ongoing. My personal opinion is that moral disgust is non-existent. It's an offshoot or a byproduct of sexual disgust or anger. But that's sexual disgust. But the results here with sexual disgust are similar to the binding foundation. So when sexual disgust sensitivity goes up, people who have microchips, especially superhuman microchips, are dehumanized more. That's not me, good. Are dehumanized more than they would be if you had low sexual disgust.
How is dehumanization measured there? So what's in there?
I would shake this person's hand. I think this person deserves to be human. I think this person is still capable of emotions, so forth and so on. 10 items like that averaged together. Any other questions? Yes?
These are a little bit on the side, but they just caught my eye. In the first one, there was a variable that this nurse or doctor AI was incompetent. How can a machine be incompetent? There is only one machine or cybernetic creature that I know that was incompetent. That was General Grievous, because he has some lung disease due to the smoking. But how can a machine can be incompetent? Then another question, if I can get these all together. In that Uncanny Valley, there was this drop when the android became too much of a human-like. There was this drop. I was wondering, because these dystopians about AI development has been dealt with in several sci-fi series, like in The Outer Limits in the 90s. Could these be effective for the results? Have these questions been done before this time? Have these questions been made before this time for the results have affected the sci-fi series? And the last one, Was the AI in the fishermen and the drunken boaters, was the AI aware of these conditions, and how in the background story was the AI aware of those, that they were drunk and they were the guilty party of this?
Yes, the AI was aware of all of that. We kept it as identical as possible for human and AI in all of them. But let me get you the exact wording of the nursing robot competence manipulation. And while I'm searching for that, I can say that we have tried to, in most of our studies, we have tried to control for the level of science fiction hobbyism among our participants. But in the nursing robot studies, those are not adjusted for level of exposure to science fiction. But we did adjust all of these results here for science fiction familiarity, and we have done that in other studies as well. We didn't do that for the rescue robots. Sometimes it's a matter of, do you have enough data to do that? Sometimes it's a matter of, can you keep the manuscript compact enough to do that? If you put that stuff in, the manuscript easily explodes. But the manipulation for the competence, positive or high competence description, Leena or Leena X has performed well in its work recently and performs tasks competently with great precision. And the same for low competence. And then there's Leena Med's colleagues praise it for its abilities. And low competence, Leena Med has been making constant mistakes in its work recently and performs tasks incompetently with little precision. Leena Med's colleagues think that its abilities are not up for the job. So that's how we did it. But how would a robot be incompetent? It could be just, people who decide on the robotization of hospitals need to order a product, and then they don't buy the best product, they buy the cheapest product, and maybe it doesn't have as good sensors as the more expensive product, and maybe there are unexpected accidents. Naturally, it's a simplified vignette-based experiment. It cannot be ecologically 100% valid ever. Yes?
You did say something about this, or even a lot about this, but I didn't quite understand.
Right.
How did you find these participants in these studies, and who were they exactly?
Participants, depending a bit on the study stream. Some of the people, we had a physical lab actually in 5A, right there, behind the wall. We recruited in many of the lab studies, which here would be studies 2, 3, and 4, and 5, I think. They were lab studies, so people came in and sat at the computer and used the mouse and headphones and were listening to pink noise. The larger study 6 here, for instance, was collected online from a service called Prolific Academic, where people can anonymously sign up, and then you have a certain budget, and then you say that if you participate in my study, I will give you £1. Usually they are from UK, so you pay in pounds. So people take the study. If they finish the study in certain time, they get compensated by the platform that is used for the data collection. In the nursing robot, some of the data was collected through student emailing lists here in Finland. Some of it was collected in the lab. Some of it was collected from Prolific Academic. The same thing for the rescue robots. So wherever we can get the data, we could take it.
Okay, and the participants here, were they like theology students, or who were they?
Random people who attended a library. Like, they were not specific group of people ever. Like some of the data we collected, we recruited the participants from the library, people of different ages, different backgrounds, not specifically theology students, like varied.
So you just went there and asked, like, you would like to participate?
Yes, we had a table there in the library lobby, and we had a sign, please come and participate in a study. Then we brought them to the lab, yes.
So did you control religiosity?
In some of the studies, yes, but not in these results. We haven't controlled for religiosity specifically, no.
So,
But we have the variable, theoretically we could.
so do you know if it has been done before, studies like this? So that or could you say that maybe the binding stuff would probably correlate with some type of religiosity, and then you could infer something from there?
Yes, in our first Mind Upload paper from 2018, a research that I didn't discuss, we did run 4 studies where we did control the results for religiosity. But what happened was that religiosity was a significant predictor of things until you entered the moral foundations variables into the statistical model. Then the effect of religiosity disappeared.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I may follow up. In many of those cases, it seems that the difference between the human and the non-human agent is not significant, or could you say that it's insignificant?
You can say that it's statistically non-significant. So the key finding specifically in the rescue robots and the nursing robots is that there is a statistically significant difference in certain decisions, but not in every type of decision. The difference in nursing robots is basically whether the robot respects patient autonomy or not. That's where you find the difference. So if the robot disobeys and respects the patient autonomy, no difference between human. But if the robot deviates from that, doesn't respect patient autonomy, then there is disapproval. If the robot rescues the culpable party to the accident, then it's not okay.
Yeah.
But in every other case, it seems to be okay.
Yeah.
Like it's the same level as the human.
Yeah. So it might be that, because the difference might be a result of some biological factors that are innate in a human nature to some extent, and also, I mean, you try to control the sci-fi hobbyism, so that it could be also a result of our culture or cultural milieu. So if our culture changes, so it might be that it will become even less significant. But how does the sci-fi hobbyism actually correlate? So if you read a lot of sci-fi, are you more open or less open? Because
I haven't looked at the data for a while. We are preparing a paper on sci-fi hobbyism, but it's still underway. But if I remember correctly, sci-fi hobbyism doesn't correlate, for instance, with sexual disgust. You can be high or low in sexual disgust and at the same time high or low in sci-fi hobbyism. If I remember correctly, you can also be high or low in openness to experience and high or low in sci-fi hobbyism at the same time. If I remember correctly, there was some association, but it wasn't one-to-one. So sci-fi hobbyism is not a proxy for openness to experience, and it's not a reverse proxy for sexual disgust. That much I can say.
yeah.
And indeed, if culture changes, our results will change. The clear findings with sci-fi hobbyism indicate that indeed, if the culture changes, it will influence the results. That's why we used this variable. So that much is certain.
Yeah. Because it's quite interesting. My colleague in USA, he did some of his studies relating to the transhumanism stuff, and he visited these garages in California where people are implanting stuff into their bodies, and he just told me stories about how Christians are not necessarily very actively involved in putting stuff in their bodies, but I mean, just one example.
It's a recent book by Ross Douthat. He's a conservative New York Times columnist, a devout Catholic, who's probably score very high on sci-fi hobbies, and also score pretty high on binding values. So it's actually quite interesting. I don't know what it tells us, but I just find it very interesting that you can have conservative Christians who are very much into sci-fi. So that there seems to be no correlation there.
Or if there is, it's not. Even if it's statistically significant, it doesn't seem to be a large effect size.
Yeah.
So, but indeed, like one of my favorite sci-fi book experiences was written by Orson Scott Card, and he is Christian at least. A Mormon, yeah. And it was the first Ender's Game, I think. Yeah, so it's a good one. Yep.
I was just wondering, what is the reason behind the fact that the decisions made by robots are less approved than by those made by humans? Is that they're different, or is it that they are less capable, maybe making good decisions? What do you think?
Yes, well, the high competence, low competence manipulation seems to suggest that it's not about the perceived abilities. I skipped the rescue robot studies where we tried to manipulate the level of cognitive abilities or level of mindedness the robot has. Doesn't seem to matter. However, the dominating theory currently, the dominating model, which has the most support, is that it is about the fact that robots are perceived to be minded, less minded than humans, but it doesn't translate into our studies. We cannot replicate that theory completely because we only find the effect in certain decisions, which makes it puzzling. So why only in certain decisions? It should be across the board if it's about how minded we perceive the robots to be. But so if you would ask someone else in the field, they would tell you it's because they are perceived to have less mind than humans. But based on my studies, I can't completely agree with that. I can agree with that maybe 75 to 80%, but then I would say that there's still this problem that we would need to explain. The answer is nobody knows, honestly. Yes?
There is this ice cream robot at the shopping center in Itis, and I visited quite often. I go past it, but only once I have seen it's used, and all the other time I've seen that it's not being used. Do you have any idea why it's not being used? I don't know if it's too much expensive for the regular one, but or is it some kind of racism towards robots?
I don't. Honest answer, I would have to study it, and that would probably take me 5 to 7 years to answer your question. But the speculation of a layperson in this case would probably be that buying an ice cream is not just about getting ice cream; it's also about having the human connection with the cute ice cream sales guy or gal. And it's about having able to talk about what the which flavor would be nice and stuff like that. And I would think that the buying of the ice cream ritual is more important in making the decision where to buy the ice cream from than just getting the ice cream. I think the ritualistic aspect matters to monkeys like us. Yes.
But self-service cashiers are much more popular than now that they have appeared. But there is no robot, you have to do it by yourself.
There's
So no
interaction. So you just throw the stuff on their belt, and so you don't really engage with.
Yeah, but there was this human connection argument here that.
Yeah, but in the case of cashier, there is less. It's less relevant.
Yeah, and I think people are more busy in the cashier. However, in Iso Omena in Sello, like Espoo, 10-15 kilometers away, there is specifically a cashier queue that is sometimes longer, much longer than the other queues, and it is specifically a slow cashier, and people use it, and the idea is that you can talk to the salesperson, and it is quite popular. People want to talk to the cashier about, I don't know, whatever, whether the hockey, the latest, whatever. There seems to be a need for that, although I see your point when it comes to cashiers and auto cashiers. As I said, it would probably take me 5 to 7 years to answer your question, and it still would be inconclusive. Yes?
Okay, so how did you ask about religion? Like, what questions did you use? And also, was there any difference, like age difference? Like, did the older people respond differently than?
In some of the unofficial analysis that we've run, age matters, but usually the effect of age disappears when you add other variables. But the exact questions of the religiosity, give me a moment. So specific questions that I'm not prepared for those. Let's see here. So I will read this in Finnish, if it's okay. From 1 to 7, how important it is for you to do one or the other. 1, not at all important, 7, very important. Kirkkoon tai uskontokuntaan kuuluminen, samaan uskonnolliseen ryhmiin kuuluvien ihmisten tapaaminen, uskontoni sääntöjen noudattaminen, säännöllinen rukoilu, uskontoni Jumalan palveluksiin tai vastaaviin osallistuminen, uskontoni pyhien tekstien lukeminen, and so forth and so on. So it's about attendance and actual practice. We had also spirituality measure, but that we didn't look at all. We just took the religiosity questions. That's how we asked. So it would encompass, I don't know, a Muslim who would participate in an experiment, or a Catholic or a Protestant, it wouldn't matter. And if you're interested in the religiosity results stuff, it's open access, it's available. It's the First Mind upload paper. It's on Nature, Humanities and Social Sciences communication paper. What predicts approval of mind upload, I think, is the name of the paper, and then it has religiosity, sexual disgust, yada yada listed after.